Welcome to the show, Jacqueline. I'm really excited to have you on to talk about your passion here. So why don't you introduce yourself to the audience, let them know what your background is, what you're doing, and we're going to dive right in. I think it's going to be a great show.
Thanks, David. Well, my name is Jacqueline Throop-Robinson, and I have been working in employee engagement and leadership for about 30 years now. And about 20 years ago, I formed a company called Spark Engagement with the sole purpose of investigating passion at work, with ensuring that we were able to equip individuals with the tools and knowledge they needed in order to own their own passion. So that's really what we're all about.
Okay, and then you've also written one book, and then you have another one coming out. Talk to us about the one book. I mean, I've written a few myself. I know it's a lot of work. So what kind of drove you to put your thoughts down in a book?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the book is called Fire Up Your Team, and it's 50 ways for leaders to connect, collaborate, and create with their teams. It's on Amazon, and I'm happy to say it was a bestseller for a short period of time. So it's been great. And what drove me to doing that book is at that point, after about 20 years doing leadership development work and doing a lot of workshops, seminars, speaking, I found that I wanted to leave something behind that was more substantive than a workbook or notes that people took from the workshops. And so I decided to sort of collect all of my best stories and client examples, personal examples, and embed the theory within those client stories and case studies so that people could work their way through these 50 ways and really kind of maintain a leadership development practice, with very short chapters, short activities, and just to try to help with that transfer of learning, really, because workshops are great, but the stats are pretty dismal when you look at how much is retained. So this was, to give people a resource really following the workshops.
Yeah, what they apply. So I'm kind of curious. I was taught that I can't motivate people. What I have to do is create a self-motivating work environment. So I'm
So
kind of curious how your work either plays into that or proves it wrong.
I think you are 100% correct. And so what we say is passion's a choice. And our work is all around how individuals can own and know how to nurture and sustain their passion. Whereas our work with leaders is how do they create the conditions in which it makes it like easier for people to be passionate, because leaders can be an obstacle to passion or they can help enable it, right? So it's about creating the conditions, but I'm 100% with you. It's got to be owned by the individuals. And, sometimes people resist that idea. It's really fascinating to me. In some ways, I think it's easier to say, oh, my manager is just such a pain, or, this organization's dysfunctional, rather than really looking at what are your engagement drivers? What are your passion drivers? And how do you create that for yourself wherever you are?
Do you have like a before and after story that you can give? Because it sounds like you've done some incredible work with companies.
Yeah, we've got a lot of before and after stories, and one which is really interesting. This is looking at it at an organizational level, but it comes down to the individual story. We were working with an organization in the Caribbean that was really struggling, and they were in the red. And the CEO was pretty with it and pretty enlightened. And she sort of said, I want to make employee engagement my main strategy for getting out of the red, which is not a common response from a CEO. So, right off
Yeah.
the bat, we've got this fantastic foundation from which we can build. And then we started working with individual profiles. So we're really fortunate. I had some fantastic researchers working with me, and we were able to identify models and survey questions where we can actually profile people's emotional state at work, passion just being one of many. And based on how they answer that survey, they have profiles, strategies, tactics. So we started working at the individual level as well in this organization. And it was really fascinating. We were there for about 3 years doing intense work anyway. And there was this one woman named Esther. And she was pretty grumpy when she came to our first session and didn't want to kind of own it. She had kind of fallen into this trap of I'm fine. It's everyone else around me, right?
Yeah. Oh, I've never known anyone like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we started working with her and her team. And fast forward a year later, she's still grumpy, but her team isn't. And they're really starting to understand this, and they're starting to get really great results. They were in customer service, so they were the front line of this organization. So it's really critical that they owned their passion and could communicate that to people walking in the door. Year 3, Esther comes back and says, I don't know why these engagement scores are going up so high. I don't see anything changing. And I just said to her, maybe you're not changing. And in that moment, she got it. She took it seriously and completely turned around. But she is like the toughest cookie we've ever had, like 3 years in. But it just shows you, with the right support and the right team and the right leadership, anyone can end up owning it. It might not be easy, but in the end, and typical organizations have anywhere from 25% to 30% of employees who are not in a good place. They have a negative energy rather than a neutral or positive energy. And this organization got it down to 5%. It was basically non-existent. But the CEO was like tenacious. She was like, we're going to crack this nut. So
Well, that's great.
it was a great story.
That must have been hard work, because in some ways, you kind of had to work around her, and people had to believe in it before their boss believed in it. And so, but you gave her a little whack on the head with your question there. So that's really cool. I'm curious, don't you do something called like a Spark Engagement Index or something like that?
Yeah, so we have 30 measures that are able to measure the actual emotional experience of an employee. So if they're in a frustrated state or a passion state, or if they're quite neutral, or if they're feeling quite disconnected, we can measure the emotional state of each employee. And then we can provide, at an aggregated level, we can provide sort of a profile of the whole organization.
So it sounds like, from what you're saying, you not only assess what's going on, but you're also assessing the individuals, and then you're giving some teaching. I'm curious, how do you follow up on that to make certain they're applying what's being taught, what's being learned?
So it happens usually at 3 levels. So at the individual level, we do have those individual profiles that have a lot of support within them, but we also do webinars and other resources for people who can reach out. We do a lot of work with the middle management level, because at the end of the day, they have the greatest impact. You want the executives to be bought on, and they need to look at, how do our communication systems work? Are policies people friendly? Is the vision clear? Do people believe in it? I mean, there's certainly work to do at the executive level, but I find the rubber really hits the road at that mid-management level. So we invest quite heavily. Most of our clients invest quite heavily with leadership development as it pertains to engagement specifically.
Okay, so I'm kind of I'm wondering, if you're working with an organization
Yes.
and you're working with individuals, have you ever run across an individual that you thought, this person's never going to get it? And if you did, what were the indicators that that was the case?
That's a really good question, because it's most individuals will get it eventually, but sometimes time doesn't permit them to get it while they're at that particular place of work. So sometimes the extent of our work is before you leave, because trust me, the grass isn't greener. Before you leave, make sure you're very clear on what's most important to you, so that when you start to look, you know what kind of an environment will enable you to thrive. You know what is most important to you from an engagement, like those intrinsic motivators point of view. And at least know that before you go. So with that kind of conversation, I would say 9 out of 10 stay, because they recognize that, gee, yeah, these are the things that are most important to me, and I actually can get them here. I'm letting other things get in the way. But it is true, sometimes it's just not a fit, right? And so you want to help that person find a fit, because they're not helpful to the organization by staying.
I'm kind of wondering as you explain this, and I don't want to put you on the spot, and I don't necessarily need the person's name, but do you have an example of that where somebody wasn't, where you had that conversation and then they
Yes.
realize, and a lot of times my clients, when I'm working with them, they'll say, "Oh, I really like what you said. Can you give me an example?" Because you've been there.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you got an example you can share.
Well, it was interesting. The one that just popped into my mind was a woman who had been working in an organization for a number of years. And she'd been a good employee. She had been quite front and center in a particular department. But the organization had just gone through a lot of transformation. In part, it was technological, in part, it was process based. And in the end, her role required her to use technology. And she simply just didn't want to. And at first, we didn't get to the bottom of it that quickly. At first, there were other things that she was presenting, as um, being critical of what was in place. And in the end, she saw that it was really her resistance, and she had a choice to make. She had the ability to learn the technology. There's no question she did. She's a bright person. She could have done it. She actually chose not to, and she just said, "No, this is not what I signed up for. This was not what I had in mind, to sit at a computer all day." So she chose to leave, and fair, fair, right? That's not something that she wanted. Another example very recently was a
But
manager,
that's
actually.
actually a win, right?
It is
I
a
mean,
win.
that's what I'm hearing you saying. I totally agree.
It's a win.
That's worth the effort, and to look back on it as a leader, they can say we did everything we could to try to make it work for her, and she opted out. So that's a big.
I'm
I
a
do want to hear your next example, but I just wanted to emphasize what I thought I heard you saying. That's a big win for the company, because with her out of the way, doing what something is more fulfilling for her, all of a sudden somebody else steps up, and then they can run with it.
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm a huge proponent of that. If you handle transitions well, people choose for themselves, and it ends up being a much more pleasant experience for everyone. And I think in some ways, even more importantly, the people around who are witnessing this see, that people are being treated with care and dignity, and it is a win-win coming out of it. I was a corporate manager for many years, and I never once fired anyone. People left, quite a few people left, but I never fired anyone, because it's either a fit or it's not, and that's no one's fault, right? Like
Right.
it's not that anyone did anything wrong. It's just really assessing, is this the right place for me? Is it purposeful for me? One of the critical things we've discovered in our research is that to truly be passionate in your work, like truly passionate, not just say you're passionate, but actually have that emotion, your work has to be highly meaningful, and you have to have a very high sense of progress. You need both of those things. Meaning alone is not enough, because I could care a lot, but if I don't feel like I'm having any impact or I'm getting anywhere, I'm just going to be frustrated. you know?
Right. Yeah.
So people want to do work that feels fulfilling and purposeful and challenging. And once they're kind of confronted with those questions and they take them on, I think people are pretty smart. They just sometimes need the support to help them get to the decision that's right for them. And if it's right for them, it's right for the organization. I really believe that.
And what do you think about the people that say there's basically three types of opportunities you have? You have a job that's a short-term opportunity to meet your obligations. You have a
Yes.
career, which is a long-term fulfilling choice. And then actually you have a calling. What do you think of those three labels and the differences between them?
No one's ever asked me that question. I think that's actually a great question. So, interestingly, in our research, uh, there are three critical drivers of passion that we've identified, and you mentioned two of them. One is how meaningful your career is to you, how meaningful your current work is, and how meaningful your most recent work was, your past work, like the previous year. And the vocation piece is not separate for us in our research, but it aligns to how people have chosen their careers, why they've chosen their careers, and why they've chosen the work they're in. So it's sort of the backbone of everything, to be honest with you, because it's so tightly aligned to your values. So vocation and values are the two things that come together as being kind of, if you're looking at a hierarchy of what's most to least meaningful, they're at the top, right? Like, because your values and vocation, people, those things usually come together in some way, right? You're living your values through your vocation.
Ideally.
Ideally, yeah,
No, I
ideally.
definitely agree. I'm thinking about what you said a moment ago, that you talked about that you never fired anyone.
Yes.
Okay. But people made a decision that it wasn't right for them. They left. Is part of the problem there where you have most people who don't fire people, I find, and maybe I'm just missing many of them, but most of the leaders I run into who don't fire people typically are not good on firmly managing the boundaries of the role. And so they can't, what I call it is, they can't be a good cop. They can't be, how do we get through this? How do we do this? But we've got to do it because these boundaries are firm. Otherwise, we're not going to meet client expectations. We're not going to meet the profitability targets. We're not going to beat whatever. So those are all the bad cops. But the leaders I run into don't sound like they're as disciplined as what you're proposing, is that you can be very disciplined on the framework and where they're supposed to be doing it. But if you're not, you're keeping people unnecessarily. They're not doing good work. They're not contributing because you're not doing your job as a leader. It sounds like you're doing some work in that area to build up the leader's capability to more respectfully get them engaged or get them out.
Yes, absolutely. That's 100% true. So one of the principles upon which we operate is personal accountability. And that's from owning your own passion to owning your obligations at work. And when you present people with their ownership, they will maybe initially struggle and resist that a little bit, but I have never had anyone not embrace it and go, yes, that, really, because people want the best for themselves. And if you really ensure that they haven't settled for less, that's another very big piece of this. So when you're talking about meaningful work, you're really inviting people to say, what are your aspirations? When you started working, what were your hopes and your dreams for your work? It doesn't mean you want to take your hobby, your personal passion, and convert it into a profession. That may not be it, but everyone, when they start a career, they start a job, has hopes and aspirations. What were they? And a lot of people, sadly to say, have settled for less, and they don't know how to get out of that. It's almost like a little bit of a trap, right? Like, I've been in this place for a long time, it's okay, it's fine. And they don't know how to break out of that and really go back to aspiring for more.
But then it's also a trap for the leader, aren't you? You got some heavy lifting that you have to do. Maybe it's not totally heavy lifting, but you're going
Can
to take
be.
a leader who's going to introduce or reinforce the concept of meaningful work, but may not actually have the systems or the habits to do what you're teaching as far as following through and reconnecting with that. Because that's not a one-time conversation, right?
No, it's not. Actually, it's a great point you're raising. And so what we really focus on in our leadership work is giving them the models and the tools to work with those models so that they can apply that to any conversation. So although we have an index, we have a survey, if you understand how the meaning and progress formula works. So we spend a lot of time really just looking at that model and how do you surface the drivers of meaning and the drivers of progress. Once we have really embedded that model so people really understand what it looks like in practice, what questions to ask, what to listen for, they can coach people in a way that they don't need data. They can use the model to structure conversations that are really non-threatening, because what you're trying to surface is, what drives it for you, what blocks it for you, what are you looking for when you're looking for a signal of progress, what frustrates you when you don't get it. And the model is simple in the sense that it's meaning and progress. And I think that's the beauty of it, because leaders can always remember that, and there is a skill in formulating questions and listening. So there is some work in learning how to do that. But at the end of the day, the leader just has to have the intention to want to surface this. And even if their questions are clumsy, they'll get to it, right? It's just giving them a framework that is something they can follow pretty intuitively. People respond to our work often and say, well, this is really intuitive. And it's intuitive because it's just how we work as humans. you know?
Yeah,
So,
that sounds really interesting. I fully agree with it. Do you have an example maybe you could give so that people who are totally new to this concept can maybe get a verbal visual?
sure. So, for example, we were working with, this is the other story I was going to tell you earlier,
There
actually.
we
So
go. There we
I'll
go.
just bring it in now. So there was a manager we were working with who had quite a successful career in other companies and wasn't doing well in this particular company. And the organization got very focused on where she was lacking in terms of her performance areas. And they were giving her feedback on that, but not in a way that she could really hear them. And so when we introduced the meaning and progress model, we got her to talk about what her sources of pleasure were from her work, like where she felt most fulfilled, where she felt like she was making the greatest contribution, what jazzed her during the day, and then where was her least passionate work, because passion exists in action. So when you're going about your day-to-day work, when are you jazzed and when aren't you? Well, it turned out through that conversation, and I did it with her director. The work that she really loved, she excelled at. And the work that was really a struggle for her is where she was failing. And framing it that way in terms of, meaning and impact, progress, all of a sudden she saw it. Like she saw what was happening and why she was having difficulty being successful. And so the organization was great. They gave her enough time to find new work, and she left and is excelling again. So she had had this like stellar career, started to fail, didn't know why, didn't want to give up because she'd never failed in her life. So it was like, I don't want to give this up. I can figure this out. And it wasn't until we put that lens on it that she went, I don't want to figure this out. This is not my happy place. I need to move on to a place where I can do more of this work. Like we all have tolerance for work we don't love, all of us. It doesn't matter what job you do, there's going to be some facet that is not going to be fantastic. But what we've learned is everyone has a different tolerance point. I might be able to handle 20% of work that is like really detailed and numbers focused, but I don't want 80% of my work to be that, right?
That's
At
right.
that point,
Yeah.
the scale shifts and I'm no longer engaged or passionate, right? So yeah, it's a very simple formula, but really powerful and just getting people to think about their work differently rather than the traditional, metrics of performance. That's important, but there's a different conversation that can really help people serve themselves as well as the organization better.
One of the things I really like about what you just explained was that when people are stuck, a lot of times you need to bring someone in, whether it's somebody already on your team. It's usually not someone who's in the one-on-one relationship with the individual because they're already been stuck together, who can help them think out of the box, help them see something they didn't see. And that's what I heard in your story. And that must be very rewarding in your work that you're doing that, because you took from someone there was a brick wall. And it sounds like, to use that metaphor, she was just kept bashing against the brick wall. How do I get through this? And you helped her see, well, that's one brick wall, but you could go around it this way, around that way, over, under, or maybe you need to go to in another direction. And she couldn't see that herself. it took someone like yourself to change the framework.
That's exactly it. And I love what you just said about her manager. She was a manager, but her director being stuck with her. That's exactly what had happened. They
Yeah.
were in it together and couldn't really see the forest for the trees. And it did take just a different framework. And this is also really interesting. This director, who's just a fantastic person, but she's afraid of conflict. And so what was happening is she was sort of giving feedback, but kind of avoiding some of the more direct feedback. And so they were doing this dance together and it wasn't getting anyone anywhere. And the thing that's great about meaning and progress is that there's it's so subjective because it's such an individual thing that no one's wrong. It just is what it is. So you don't have to have a conversation that feels punitive to the individual. You can actually have a conversation that helps them uplift themselves and see themselves differently and in a different light. So it's like a great way of having a difficult conversation that is only going to have a positive outcome.
Yes, it's interesting too. The coaching call I was on just before I got on the podcast, one of the items was a manager who avoids confrontation. And I talked about how, well, he needs to recognize the trigger that he's in a conversation and he has to stand up for something for the company, and he moves into flight mode and he avoids it, which hurts the company, takes it, I won't go into what happens, but, and he needs to develop a new habit to overcome that habit. That, oh, wait a minute, I've been triggered. Okay, I need to move into good cop mode, and I need to be firm on the boundaries. I can still be nice. I can still be empathetic. So it's interesting what you say. It's a skill set that you have to identify what's going on, then you can address it, type of thing.
Absolutely. So the awareness piece has to
Yeah.
be there. And I don't think it was in this case until, again, as you said, a third party kind of came in to shed some light on it. It's interesting. I don't know who originally said it. It might have been John Maxwell, but I'm not sure. This idea of care and candor. And
Yeah.
I use that a lot because you need both. And people who are afraid of conflict or want to avoid conflict are often people who really, really value relationships and they don't want to damage the relationship. That's often what it is. It can be other things too, of course. But what I try to say to people is you are not serving that person well by not giving them the feedback they deserve, by not holding them accountable. That is doing them a disservice, and your relationship is not authentic as a result. So
Yeah.
your efforts to preserve the relationship are actually destroying it or making it into an unhealthy relationship. And honestly, people just tend not to see it that way. They don't realize, and I think it can help someone like that have the courage to have maybe those difficult conversations and to be able to even preface it by saying, I want the best for you and I want the best for the company. So let's figure this out together.
Yeah. And I also want to mention that when you had that conversation and help that person understand that, there's a huge ROI when, whether it's you that helps a leader be a better leader, whether it's, their manager helps someone be a better leader, whatever it is, when you can help someone overcome one of those issues, the ROI is huge. So you step back on that and you think about, you're talking about a director over, someone else who's managing, I don't know how many people, but then that change in that manager's behavior affects not only that person, but all the
Right.
behaviors of the team and their results, correct? So the ROI is significant.
It is significant. And it's one of the reasons why I invest in the coaching, because you might be helping one specific situation, but if you do that well, you can be helping future situations on a much broader level. It's interesting, when I was just listening to you speak, the other thing I'd like to mention is the value of those individual profiles and that personal accountability is it's very transparent. So we'll share with individuals, these are the kind of questions we want your managers to ask you. We want to be super transparent because we want you to ask yourself these questions. You ultimately are the one who's going to benefit from this. Your manager is there to help and support you, but you have to ask yourself some of these tough questions and be honest with yourself, because no one else can do it for you. Coming back to one of your earliest comments, no one else can do it for you. You have to see yourself as important enough to serve yourself in this way. But you were talking about the fight and flight triggers, and it can be really scary for people. We have one state of engagement that we call unfulfilled, right? So there's some meaning in their work, there's a little bit of progress, but ultimately they're feeling unfulfilled. When people see the result in their profile, they see their results. That can be a tough pill to swallow, because sometimes you've not been honest with yourself. You're trying to make your current situation okay, and all of a sudden your report says you're unfulfilled, and it's kind of like, what do you mean I'm unfulfilled? So there's a little bit of holding your results in a little bit of a tender way while you consider them. It's really interesting that this is not an unusual response. I had very recently someone get their results and they came out as a neutral. So you're not adding positive energy, but you're not detracting from the energy either. Things are fine, right? Things are just, you go with the flow, things are fine, but that's not passion, right? That's okay. It's not being passionate. And her response was, I'm a passionate person. Everyone around here can tell you I'm a passionate person. I'm sure you are. I wouldn't dispute that. How are you feeling in this moment, though? This is a snapshot of time. Tell me about your work. How are you feeling about it? And when we had that conversation, she understood that she wasn't in passion at the moment, but her identity was, I'm a passionate person. And she wasn't being honest with herself that at this moment, because it's just a snapshot of time, this is not like a personality profile where you're always frustrated or you're always neutral at the moment in time. But people sometimes, the awareness piece, once you see it, most people recognize that they need to do something about it. So all of a sudden it might not be okay to just sort of pretend with yourself that this is fine.
So you're teaching passion in the workplace, that type of thing. What about as we look at the different generations? And I don't want to just pick on the millennials, okay? Talk about each generation and how this works as far as putting them in a self-motivating work environment where they are passionate, and how that can succeed, or where the big struggles are, if you could.
So we've done in the last couple of years a lot of work with millennials versus baby boomers, because when you look at the percentage of the workplace between those two groups, that's most. I mean, there is the Gen X thing, but in terms of, it's very, very interesting from a power transfer point of view. Baby boomers are obviously getting to be a smaller group, but the millennials are growing really exponentially. And so here is what we found. I'm going to tell you a story. I was working for an insurance company, and in this particular insurance company, to become a full underwriter, it's a global company. It's huge dollars, and the underwriters, on average, to get to their authority level, took them about 7 years. Okay, so thinking of meaning and progress, they cared about their careers, they cared about, and it's not just corporate ladder, it's around exposure. They cared about being able to have autonomy. Like, there are all these things that drove why that work was meaningful. And then your level of underwriting authority demonstrates progress. So 7 years. In come the millennials, in come the assistant underwriters, who have been there a couple of years, maybe 3, and are like, well, I'm ready to go. And the senior underwriters are going, no, you're only like 2 or 3 years in. You got a few more to go. And they're going, no, I don't want to wait that long. There's this huge shift in expectations for progress. The meaning piece in our research hasn't changed so much. There are some significant changes in the sense of, for example, the extent to which millennials want to be involved with corporate social responsibility, the extent to which millennials want the values of the company to be lived. So there are some changes on the meaning side, but for our research, the progress side was hugely different. Millennials are really wanting a sense of forward movement. They want to be challenged. They want to be learning. They want exposure. They want more money. Basically, it comes down to, if I've done a good job, I've put in the effort. If I've done a good job, I want a reward. I want to see the impact. I want to see how I'm contributing. I want to make sure if I've learned something, like they are the highest, their levels of education are higher than any other generation, right? I want to take this knowledge, I want to take my talent, and I want to use it. That's a progress piece. So the conflict that we see with our clients when we're using our engagement framework is a lot around expectations for how I progress my career, how I progress my authority or autonomy in my work, how I'm empowered. It's a lot of that. And it's tough when you've been through the same journey, but it took you 10 years and someone else wants it in 3. It's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, it sure is. Now, speaking about education, you have another book you're writing that you're planning later on this year. Why don't you, as we close out here, why don't you give the audience a little hint on that, and then let them know how they can get a hold of you?
So the book is called The Passion Mindset. It will be out toward the end of the year. And what we have learned around meaning and progress is that there's objective reality, but then there's how you view things. So a lot of the book is around, how do I stay connected to meaning? How do I see progress in everything I do so that I can keep those drivers of meaning and progress present for myself as a way of sustaining my passion and creating passion. So that's, in a nutshell, what the passion mindset's about.
Well, that sounds great. And are you gonna follow a similar approach where you're kind of teaching and then do this kind of
Yes.
exercises at the end? Okay.
Yes, yes, and a lot of little mini case studies, so stories and examples through our client work.
Okay. Sounds like it should be a great read. We'll have to watch for that. And then how can people get a hold of you? Because I'm sure this has piqued some people's interest.
Sparkengagementindex.com is certainly a one way of getting in hold of us. My LinkedIn profile is always an easy way to message me that way. And of course, our Twitter, so I can provide all of that. But Throop-Robinson is the Twitter handle.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Jacqueline. I really appreciate it. This has been a fun discussion. I think really valuable. You brought up some things that haven't been covered on the show before. And so I hope some people get a hold of you. We'll definitely be tracking you. I want to see your book when it comes out. That sounds great.
Thanks so much. It's been so fun talking to you. I love the format of the show.